I'd spent the last 18 months building the Atlas project from the ground up. It was my brainchild, my late nights, my weekend sacrifices, and it had just posted a 40% profit margin in its first quarter. A company record. My reward? A summons to a packed conference room. They didn't just fire me, they made sure everyone saw it. As I stood there, my boss, the man who'd taken public credit for my work just last week, slid a single sheet of paper across the table. He tapped the performance review, the one that ignored every metric I'd shattered, and said, "We need someone who can actually handle this job." His lips barely moved, but the corners curled just enough to let me know he enjoyed every second. That was the moment I decided I'd never let anyone put me in that position again. I walked out with my head spinning, but underneath the shock, something solid started to form. Everything changed that Tuesday morning. I stepped into the office and immediately caught the forced smile of Jenna at reception. Her lips tight, eyes darting away as I passed. No one else said a word. The usual chatter was gone, replaced by a low hum and the steady tap of keyboards. The silence pressed in, but I kept moving, convincing myself it was just another meeting. Inside the conference room, my boss was already at the head of the table, his tie loosened just enough to look casual. He didn't look up right away, just shuffled some papers, then glanced at me with that practiced half smile. The rest of the team filed in, and I noticed how everyone seemed to sit a little farther from me than usual. I took my seat, feeling the distance. He started with his usual corporate opening, thanking us for our hard work, talking about the company's direction, but then his voice flattened. "We have to make some tough decisions," he said, tugging at his tie. He looked at me, then away, and I knew what was coming before he said my name. He recited a line about realignment and how the team needed someone who fit the new vision. There was nothing personal in his voice, just a cold finality. When he slid the paperwork across the table, I saw the slight curl at the edge of his mouth. He didn't say much, just, "We wish you the best." The others stared at their notebooks or the wall, pretending not to notice. For a few minutes, I sat there, listening to him drone on about opportunities and new beginnings. I barely heard any of it. I left the room without a word. My legs carried me out of the building and down the street, but I wasn't really walking anywhere. I wandered into a coffee shop and sat in the corner staring at the table. My phone sat in my hand, screen lit up with a blank email thread. I kept refreshing, hoping for someone, anyone, to reach out and say there'd been a mistake. Then, through the coffee shop window, I saw my replacement walking into the office. Fresh suit, portfolio tucked under one arm, shaking hands and smiling wide. Watching that, it hit me how quickly I'd been replaced, how easily I'd been erased. My chest tightened, and I felt heat rising in my face. I wanted to storm back in, demand answers, but I just sat there, invisible behind the glass. Driving home later, the embarrassment settled into something heavier. I replayed the meeting, the silence, the look on my boss's face. It wasn't just the job I'd lost, it was the routine, the sense of belonging, the respect I thought I had. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dashboard, feeling that sting. At home, I dropped my bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table. I opened a notebook and wrote a few words. Start again, build something, take control. It felt small, almost pointless, but I couldn't let it go. I knew I couldn't let that day define me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. The house was quiet and I just sat with it. That night, I stared at the ceiling, running through everything that had happened. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a steady determination. I wasn't sure what would come next, but I knew I couldn't let them have the last word. Sometimes the biggest decisions are made in silence, without anyone else knowing. And that's exactly how my next move began. Revenge rarely announces itself. I started with a notebook and a question. What's next? My handwriting was shaky, but just putting the words down helped. I sat in that quiet apartment, the silence thick, and thought about what my grandfather used to say. "You don't fix a flooded house by staring at the water." That line kept coming back to me whenever I felt stuck. I realized I couldn't just sit there replaying what happened. I had to move, even if I didn't know exactly where I was going. I signed up for an online marketing course the next morning. It was a small step, but it gave me something to focus on besides my own frustration. The first lesson was about understanding your value in a crowded market. The instructor quoted Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx. "Embrace what you don't know, especially in business." That stuck with me. I started looking for more stories like hers, people who'd built something from nothing, who didn't let setbacks become dead ends. Most days, I kept a low profile. I stretched my last paycheck, skipped dinners out, and spent more time at my kitchen table, working through lessons and scribbling plans. The nights were harder. Sometimes I'd stare at the page for an hour, write something down, cross it out, and start over. The self-doubt didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, making me question if I was wasting my time. But I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that even a small bit of progress was better than nothing. I focused on learning things I'd always avoided before: contracts, budgeting, the basics of negotiation. I watched free webinars, took notes, and tried to picture myself actually using these skills. It felt awkward at first, but I kept going. I told myself that every night spent reading or practicing was one more tool I could use when the time came. Eventually, I reached out to a few old colleagues. Not everyone responded, but the ones who did were honest. I bought coffee for anyone willing to share advice. One conversation led me to a mentor, a retired business owner who'd weathered his own storms. He didn't waste time sugarcoating things. "You can't build a future if you're stuck looking backward," he said. "Revenge feels good, but it doesn't pay the bills. Focus on building something real." Still, my old company was never far from my mind. I saw their posts on LinkedIn, watched as they announced new hires and celebrated milestones. It stung, but instead of letting it eat away at me, I used it as fuel. I started studying business acquisitions, reading up on how struggling companies get bought out and turned around. I wanted to know what it would take to get back into the game, on my own terms. One night, deep into a research spiral, I found a small press release online about my old company hunting for investors. My heart skipped a beat. It was just a few lines buried on a local business site, but it was enough. They weren't as secure as they looked. That was the crack I'd been looking for. From that moment, my focus sharpened. I mapped out what I'd need: money, partners, a clear plan. I started calling in favors and pitching my idea to anyone who'd listen. I met with a contact who had experience in acquisitions, and he walked me through the basics: what to look for, how to spot red flags, and how to keep your intentions quiet until the timing was right. I started building a plan, piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. I pooled what little savings I had, reached out to friends with business backgrounds, and slowly built a small group of people who believed in what I was trying to do. Each step felt risky, but I kept reminding myself of my goal. I paid close attention to every detail, double-checking numbers, reading every contract twice. There were setbacks, deals that fell through, funding that almost didn't come together, but I kept pushing. The more I learned, the more I realized that success wasn't about making noise. It was about patience, persistence, and knowing when to move. I watched, waited, and prepared, making sure I was ready when the right moment finally came. Revenge in business isn't about rage. It's a chess match, and timing is everything. I spent hours studying how takeovers actually work, watching as companies quietly changed hands while most people never noticed until it was over. Patience wasn't my natural strength, but I knew that if I moved too quickly, I'd lose my shot. I had to wait for the right opening. That opening came when I dug deeper into my old company's financials. The press release about them seeking investors wasn't just a blip. It was the start of a pattern. I found a quarterly report that showed a sharp dip in their operating margin, something they tried to gloss over in their public statements. Industry news hinted at a shift in the market, and my old company was clinging to the same product line while competitors adapted. They were pouring money into a new software platform that wasn't catching on, and the numbers told the story. They were stretched thin. The more I read, the more obvious it became that they were in trouble, but trying to hide it. With that knowledge, I started lining up people who could help. I needed investors who understood that this wasn't just about payback. It was about recognizing a real opportunity. I spent weeks meeting anyone who'd listen, but most of those conversations led nowhere. The meeting that changed things happened in a cramped downtown office. The investor was blunt. "You're asking me to back you in buying out your old boss. Why should I believe you can turn it around?" I laid out the numbers, pointed to the failed product launch, and showed how the right changes could make the company profitable again. I kept my voice steady, focusing on facts instead of old grudges. For a moment, he just looked at me. Then he nodded. "I'll back you, but only if you bring in a team who knows how to fix this." That was the yes I needed. As I pulled together the rest of my partners, I kept everything quiet. If word got out that I was behind the bid, management could have blocked me or tried to drive up the price. I used intermediaries and kept my name off every document I could. The process dragged on longer than I wanted. There were days when I wondered if I'd miscalculated, especially when I heard rumors that a bigger competitor was interested in buying the company. For a few tense weeks, I thought I'd lost my chance altogether. But then, almost overnight, the rivals' deal fell apart. I never found out exactly why, but suddenly, the path was clear again. Negotiations with my old company weren't easy. Every term was a fight. I had to give a little more than I wanted in some areas, but I made sure the final agreement left me with real control. I relied on people I trusted to handle the back and forth, keeping my distance until the last possible moment. There was always the risk that someone would connect the dots, but we managed to keep things quiet. The hardest part was the waiting. I checked my phone constantly, running through scenarios in my head about what could go wrong. My partners were anxious too, but I kept them focused on the plan. The numbers worked, the timing was right, and the company's leadership was desperate enough to take the deal. Then, just after lunch one afternoon, my phone rang. It was my intermediary. "It's done," he said. "You're the owner." For a second, I just sat there, letting it sink in. I'd actually pulled it off. The company that tossed me aside was now mine. But getting the company wasn't the end. The real moment, the one I'd been waiting for, was still ahead. Walking back into that office, my office, everything felt both familiar and changed. The hallway was the same, the coffee still stale, but now every step felt deliberate. When I entered the meeting room, my former boss was already there. His face went ashen, like he'd been punched in the gut. He stared at me, silent, barely blinking, as I introduced myself as the company's new owner. I kept my voice steady. I didn't gloat. His silence was enough. "Next time you're knocked down, remember this moment. Rejection isn't a finish line. It's a starting point. If this story fired you up, hit subscribe and share your own comeback moments in the comments.